Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, bank turbulence, budget turmoil, and TikTok trouble. Joining us to discuss all of this is AAF President Douglas Holtz-Eakin, and later on, Director of Technology and Innovation Policy, Jeffrey Westling. Doug, thanks for joining us. How have you been?
Always a pleasure. Doing great. No complaints.
You know, it's opening day, so I'm in a great mood today. So hopefully we have a great podcast because of that.
It's opening day for Major League Baseball for those who don't live that.
Yeah, those specifics. I mean, come on. It's the Red Sox haven't lost yet, so I still feel like, got some hope for the season.
Yeah, well, the Pirates just peaked in the standings too, so.
All right, let's jump into things. Doug, you're up first. As always, why don't you tell us what's on your mind?
Well, we're going to talk bank turbulence, but what's on my mind is the sort of out of proportion call for additional law to regulate mid-sized banks. There is no evidence, zero, that this was a problem with the law. This was, Silicon Valley Bank was on the Fed's watch list. I mean, they had all sorts of problems. The Fed knew it. They had the authorities to deal with and didn't for reasons that remain unclear. And so I don't understand what the president's doing calling for new laws. I don't understand why there's this focus on 2018 fine-tuning that we saw. This is something that is clearly all politics and has nothing to do with the empirical realities.
Yeah.
Other than that, I'm good with it.
Sounds about right. It just seems like this is just one of those calls to look like you're doing something and act like you're doing action.
There's some things they should do, though. There should be a thorough investigation of the supervision of the Silicon Valley Bank, and it should be done by someone other than the Fed itself. I mean, the Fed's going to do that, and they might learn some lessons for themselves. But from the point of view of the public, there should be a third party that takes a close look at this, and Congress is the natural place to have that happen.
Interesting. Well, as you mentioned, we're talking about bank turbulence today, so this is a great reaction to start with. Let's jump into the latest on the banks. The big news this week was that First Citizens Bank stepped in to buy a significant portion of the Silicon Valley Bank assets. Put this into context for us. Where are we with the state of the banking industry?
At this point, we have seen Silvergate, a crypto casualty, resolved. We saw Signature closed. That's also a crypto casualty. Silicon Valley Bank, casualty of poor management and poor supervision, evidently, and Credit Suisse taken over by UBS, because Credit Suisse is one of the worst banks we've ever seen for a decade now. And so those are four isolated cases. That's not a general problem with the banking system in the United States. You hear these public officials say all the time, the banks are well capitalized and have adequate liquidity. That's actually true. So I don't have deep concerns about the banking system per se, but we have seen some people unable to manage the rise in interest rates, and that's a lesson. They've got really good at credit risk, people defaulting on mortgages, which is the last crisis. Now you have to relearn interest rate risk, which is a real thing, and managing it.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned the last crisis. I mean, you would know better than I would, being on the commission that studied this. I mean, this doesn't have the same feel as what we dealt with back in the 2008 crisis.
Yeah, this isn't the 2008 crisis all over again. That was characterized by a couple things we haven't seen at all. Number one, it was global. There were problems in banks all across the globe. It was a huge credit bubble, largely in the U.S., a home mortgage bubble. Subprime mortgages were the poster child of that. And they infected everybody's balance sheets in a way that no one understood or knew about. They had all these very complicated derivatives, and it turned out what you thought was a safe asset wasn't, and it all disappeared. So it's really different in its character. Now, the one thing that was interesting to me is that at its root in the U.S., the 2008 crisis was bad mortgage origination. People were getting mortgages who should never have gotten mortgages, and those mortgages then failed to perform, and the whole house of cards came tumbling down. Mortgage origination is a pretty basic banking function, right? This time, the problems we've seen have to do with maturity mismatch. You borrow short term, that's a deposit, and someone can take it out at any time, and then you lend longer term or invest longer term. These long-term treasuries were the the Silicon Valley example. And that's also a basic feature of banking. Maturity mismatch and managing it is something they're supposed to be able to do. So in each case, a basic function was not done well, and that's a problem.
Interesting. Yeah. So more broadly speaking, with the broader economy, some are arguing that the recent banking sector turbulence is a harbinger of a recession. I mean, later on down the road, later this year, has the risk of recession increased in your mind?
I don't think so. My summary is, if you thought it was likely we were headed for a recession prior to these episodes, you probably still do. And if you thought we were going to dodge it and have a soft landing, we probably still can. There were two things that went on as a result of the turbulence. Number one, it is true that banks will be more cautious going forward. They will, at the same interest rate, deny some loans that they might otherwise have made, and that restricts the credit and probably restricts aggregate demand, and other things being the same would be a movement toward recessionary pressures. But the flip side is that we saw interest rates drop a lot. About 6 months worth of increases went away overnight. That makes things easier and goes the other direction. So on balance, I think it's almost a wash. We do have some indicators, like there's a Chicago Fed indicator of financial conditions, whether it's got like 100 variables that it collects. It shows a modest tightening of financial conditions. So I think if it might be directionally toward recessionary pressures, but not large.
Interesting. I'm sure this is not the last time we'll be talking about this. As you mentioned, regulators are already starting to think about what their response is, and I'm sure Congress will be picking up on this in the future.
Oh yeah, we will hear a lot about this.
Let's turn to fiscal policy. Yesterday, the House Budget Committee held a hearing titled "The Fiscal State of the Union," which, for once actually sounds like something that, the Budget Committee should be looking at. Any good takeaways from this hearing?
No real drama. I don't think we had a revelation. I think we had a reinforcement that, viewed from any number of perspectives, the federal budget's on an unsustainable trajectory, that we need to take major reforms as at the heart of fixing it, not nibbling at the edges with caps on discretionary spending, things like that. And then a lot of finger pointing about whose fault it is, right? All of this is George W. Bush's fault, and the eighth term of the 2001 tax cuts or something. I mean, you hear that. On the other side, you hear Republicans just complaining about the spending, but one of the things that they got asserted was, we just roll back to pre-pandemic levels, we'll solve this problem. And that's just not true. Going into the pandemic, we had an unsustainable federal budget situation. We then spent a lot of money and still have an unsustainable federal budget. So, there's some real work that needs to be done. Both sides need to get serious. Yeah, I mean,
we're in the finger-pointing stage of this whole situation, but hopefully at some point we'll get to the educating the public, whether it comes through the campaign season, because we have tough decisions that we have to make ahead. The budget is going to come home to roost in 10 years at this point.
So weirdly, we're in one of these situations where it's in no one's interest to do nothing, yet that's what we're doing, right? Republicans who are concerned about the rising debt and the headwinds that provides for growth want to take action and bring it down. Democrats who care deeply about social programs are doing nothing to shore up Medicare, which has got about 4 years of life in the Part A trust fund, or Social Security, which has a decade in its trust fund. There should be action from both sides on those programs, because they are the red ink and they are core parts of the social safety net, and they should be shored up for the future.
All right, well, it's now time for my favorite part of the podcast. At this point, we're going to take our break and do the segment called Fact of the Day Trivia.
Why is this considered a break, by the way?
Just a break in the action, changing things up. And it's on the debt. It's a debt question. So, but it also brings in one of the topics that you also wrote about this week. Between 2024 and 2027, how much is it estimated that the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act will increase the deficit?
Let's see. We got 350 out of CHIPS and Science, and we've got about 310 from the IRA. So, let's call it 650 round.
Yeah. So estimates earlier from AAF research were $10 billion per year from the 2024 to 2027.
It's too low.
So
Who are these people?
But it's per year.
Who are these people?
It is per year.
Okay.
But the CHIPS Act is back up this week because of the regulations that are starting to come out with it.
Right.
And I know you had a lot to say about those issues.
I'm baffled, usually really disappointed and frustrated with what they're doing with the CHIPS Act. I was never a big fan, but let's suppose that we agreed it'd be a good idea to have a $52 billion subsidy to semiconductor to the building fabrication plants for semiconductors in the United States. You'd think the thing you'd want to do is plow as much of that money as possible into semiconductor fabrication plant construction and do it as cheaply as possible. And everything they're doing is diverting resources away. It's got to go to community groups of interest and sort of other people who are in the affected area. It has to be done with union wages and make it more expensive, and you have to have daycare centers, and now they are putting caps on overseas growth. China in particular, you can't grow more than 5% on new technologies in China and 10% on old ones. You tell me where 5 and 10 came from, right? Which supercomputers spat those out? So they're just literally trying to load up this bill with every piece of their social agenda, and it doesn't make any sense.
Interesting. Well, Doug, thanks for joining us. We're gonna move on to our next guest for this podcast. So thanks for bringing down those two things for us.
My best to Jeff. Knock him dead.
So at this point, we're going to bring in AAF's Director of Technology and Innovation Policy, Jeffrey Westling. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So welcome. It's your podcast debut. Are you excited? You ready to go?
Really excited. First time participant, long-time listener.
All right, so as you know, we're going to talk about TikTok and the hearings that they had last week. Last week, Congress held a hearing with TikTok CEO to discuss a potential ban on the application here in the United States. What are Congress's stated concern, and are they legitimate in your view?
Yeah, so the concern with TikTok right now is more with the parent company ByteDance. So ByteDance is a Chinese company. There's a lot of ties to the CCP, and Congress and a lot of security intelligence officials are concerned that TikTok is going to be able to use Americans' data negatively and give that data over to the CCP and give them a lot of information about what Americans are doing, what they're looking at online. And a lot of these security concerns are there's a lot of evidence of potential, but there isn't as much evidence of the actual sharing of information yet. And TikTok's doing a lot to try to assuage some of these concerns. But from what we've been hearing, a lot of this is legitimate. There are, real risks with TikTok using Americans' data and collecting more data. But it's not just on the security side where maybe they're tracking, what you're doing, what you're browsing, whatever. There's also concern that they can use the application to push out Chinese propaganda or misinformation that is theoretically harmful to Americans. And I know a lot of folks have been trying to compare this to we wouldn't let Russia have a broadcast station during the Cold War. It's a similar idea. And then finally, some of Congress, some of the concerns with some of the legislatures is even on a more fundamental level that has less to do with China and just more to do with TikTok as an application harming children. It's pushing out content that, can be bad for children to see, and it can be addictive. It can be troublesome. So I think to answer the original question, which is this concern legitimate? I think there is legitimate concern. There isn't a ton of evidence yet of TikTok actually engaging in some of these fears, but the potential in the source code and because there's control of the company by ByteDance, those concerns are realistic, and there is a potential for harm that Congress needs to be examining carefully.
Yeah, so with those concerns in mind, many states have already banned the use of TikTok on government phones and such. I think a lot of federal agencies have done the same. Should the federal government do the same for more broadly speaking? Should we be looking at a ban? An outright ban of the app?
Well, I think it's important to understand that an outright ban of the app is kind of an excessive response. It's an extreme response to the problem, and it might be an appropriate one, but there are less, extreme alternatives to address some of these concerns. If the concern is TikTok is collecting and sharing American data with the CCP, you can pass a broad privacy law that restricts all companies' ability to collect and share information, because as it stands, China can just get that information because Facebook or Twitter or whoever has that information online, and you can buy and sell that information. So if the concern is the data, maybe you go with something more targeted towards like a privacy legislation. Also, when you actually ban the application, you start running the risk of going a little too far with it. Right now, we've seen something like the Restrict Act, which Senator Warner introduced and has a lot of co-sponsors right now, which would go really far to give the executive branch a lot of authority to deem things as national security risks when they might or might not be. And when you give the federal government that much power, it's easy for them to continue to use that power in ways maybe we didn't anticipate or didn't want them to do. So I get a little concerned when that becomes the solution, when there might be less restrictive means to go after some of these things. And also, I mean, maybe we'll get into it a little bit more, but there's also the First Amendment concerns in that we've got a lot of Americans who use TikTok, right? And they share their content with their friends, their family, their communities. And when you take away that app, you're taking away an avenue to get that speech out. So there's a lot of constitutional concerns with it as well.
Yeah. So break that down a little bit, Marty. Let's get into it a little bit more.
Yeah, sure.
What are those First Amendment concerns?
Yeah, so it's a little twofold. On the one hand, you do have TikTok, which the subsidiary, it has First Amendment rights itself, right? Like it can put content out, and if you are Congress, you don't like the content they're pushing, there's a First Amendment concern with saying, okay, we don't like the content, you can't do that. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you have to have compelling government interest, and this is a necessary means to achieve that interest. I don't know if it's necessary to achieve those interests, right? You can theoretically find other ways of mitigating some of these harms without an outright ban. I think where most of the focus, though, is less on TikTok's First Amendment rights because of the ties to China. People don't, right or wrong, people don't seem to care about that as much as they do the user's First Amendment rights, right? Where TikTok is an outlet for a lot of creators and a lot of people to communicate and share and connect with people. And when you go ahead and ban the app outright, when you just take that avenue of communication away, it's really restrictive to those American citizens' ability to communicate and share information. So the concerns are legitimate. And again, when it comes to these First Amendment questions, when you're looking at it from a legal perspective, the question isn't, is this restricting speech? I mean, it is, but the legal question comes down to how are you achieving a government interest here, and are you doing it in a way that maybe there are less restrictive alternatives? Like I talked about the privacy law. If you're concerned with the data security and you ban TikTok, there's going to be these First Amendment issues. Maybe you just go for something like privacy law, which restricts their ability to collect and share information while still having that avenue for communication and dialogue. So you still have those discussions, that avenue for communication without necessarily taking things away entirely.
Yeah, along those same lines, and adding in the whole thing about what you said earlier about the unintended consequences of some of the legislation they're passing, and briefly, is there broader implications about some of this stuff being used for other social media platforms that are not Chinese owned?
So it's tough to say right now because the focus is so much on TikTok, and that's where everything is. But when you give the government that kind of power, and we've seen this in the past, every time a social media company moderates content in a way that Congress doesn't like, they start holding hearings and bringing them in. If now all of a sudden we have the power to say, if you don't do the thing we want you to do, you're going to get banned because we deem you a national security risk, that's worrisome. It's definitely something that could lead to a slippery slope. And I always get concerned when you first get that camel's nose under the tent, right? Because it's really easy to get in and get the entire regime kind of come crumbling down. And it's important that we just carefully examine this in the context of TikTok. And if we do end up banning TikTok, and again, I haven't seen a lot of the classified information about what they're doing, so maybe a ban is justified. It should be narrowly focused on TikTok and not something that broadly grants the executive branch the ability to just declare things as security risks and ban them again, or take aggressive steps on limiting what they can and can't do under the guise of security.
Interesting. I've never heard that saying before. The camel under the tent. I've never heard that one.
I think that's an old telecom one back in the old AT&T monopoly days. So that's a fun one we can go into on another podcast.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thanks for coming on and breaking all this down. I'm sure this is not the last time we'll hear about social media and content moderation and everything else that we have to deal with the new emergence of this focus on social media.
We'll definitely be talking more about it. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.